and welcome to Seize the Data. Today we're joined by Alaa Moussawi, who serves as the Chief Data Scientist for the New York City Council, where he leads a team of data scientists called the Data Operations Unit, as well as overseeing the Council's Web Development Unit. In addition, he serves as the Chief Scientist and partner of GSC Assets, a crypto hedge fund leading the pack in year-to-date rankings according to Nielsen Hedge. We're excited for this one, so I'm going to pass it over to Logan to take it away.
Hi, welcome to Seize the Data. Today we have Dr. Moussawi. He is the Chief Data Scientist at the New York City Council, as well as the Chief Scientist at GSE Assets. We're very excited to have you as a guest today on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Logan.
Awesome. Well, we can dive right into it. So if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your current role, I guess roles, plural. Would love to learn more.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start off with some educational background. I am a physicist by training. I studied networks, specifically spreading processes in networks. And after that, I joined the New York City Council while nearly simultaneously starting up or co-founding GSC Assets, which is a crypto hedge fund that I'm a partner with. And at the council, I serve as Chief Data Scientist, where I lead the Data Operations Unit and the Web Development Unit.
Wow. So I guess my first question after hearing a little bit about your background is, how did you go from particle physics and networks to data science?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. And so I wasn't in particle physics necessarily. I was studying networks. And so the study of networks is pretty interdisciplinary. You have a lot of mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, maybe even statisticians that all get into the field of network science. And the reason that physicists get into the field of network science is because the backbone of network science could sometimes be thought of as statistical mechanics, or I guess the use of statistics to understand the outcomes of processes on large networks. And so it's very similar mathematically to how systems of particles are studied in statistical mechanics. And that was the angle that I came into studying network science from. And that same statistics, or very similar mathematics that goes into the statistics of studying large networks, is what goes into studying big data. And that was really my transit. I know that's a very complex explanation for a simple question, but that was how I kind of slid into that role. You know, although people don't generally think of somebody studying physics as the natural candidate for somebody going into data, it's usually people who are more into statistics. There are physicists that focus on the study of physical systems through the use of statistics.
So on the technical side, it sounds like the overlap between kind of math and science and networking can be applied to data. But I'm curious, I guess, what elements overlap more closely? Like if you could dive a little bit deeper into what mathematical areas there are overlapping.
So I guess let me think about that for a second. Generally speaking, it's the statistics. So when you're studying, when you're trying to analyze a very large set of data, you understand that there are certain, I guess, principles that apply. For example, the central limit theorem, depending on what type of data you're looking at, could generally apply. And similar principles apply in the physical world. And so, when we want to analyze or I guess make an estimate for the mean of a parameter, and we're looking at a large set of data, or whether we're looking at the estimate of a parameter within a large system, like a collection of like a gas, that's made up of billions and trillions of particles. We apply the same mathematics to understand the behavior and be able to estimate certain parameters.
Okay, got it. Yeah, it sounds like, I guess, it's a really big data problem that you're trying to solve, and it makes a natural segue to the data science side. And then, how did you get started with the New York City Data Council? Or sorry, the New York City Council.
So I actually joined the New York City Council straight after graduating from my graduate program in physics. And I guess, like I said, I had been studying network science, and I started picking up a lot of skills that are necessary for the application of applications to big data. So I picked up more in-depth knowledge of programming, and even my advisor had nudged me and told me, Professor Cornus, that I should look at data science, if that might be something very interesting given my current background. It's probably the profession most related to what I was doing as a graduate student. And that then led me to, exploring some of what I was interested in. And I originally am from New York City. And, you could work for a particular firm and you can look at improving marketing metrics or improving the outcomes of some recommendation systems. But I thought it would be much more interesting to be able to work on a variety of problems that directly impact the lives of people in the largest city here in the U.S. And so I came to work for the New York City Council as a data scientist.
Wow. That is quite the backstory on how you got there. And then I'm curious about the biggest challenges that you've had to work on so far for the New York City Council.
There are a few challenges that have been difficult. I guess in many facets. Some of them difficult for political reasons. Some of them difficult for mathematical reasons. Some of them difficult for logistical reasons. I think one of the most interesting things to study, and a lot of studies have been focused on understanding what environmental impacts or what environmental factors impact the outcome of, or I guess the life outcome, or in another way, the future success or adulthood success of children. And I think that that's something very important to understand as a legislative branch responsible for making laws, especially in a large city, and also for policymakers within the legislative branch and for the politicians. We need to be very aware of how minute decisions or small decisions being made on the local level impact the outcomes of the children within the city. And one thing that I've always wanted to do, and this is like a project that I haven't gotten to the point of realizing yet, is performing an analysis, probably a network analysis. There are many similar analyses, usually more focused on understanding how, for example, the quality of teachers or the nutrition in the environment that children grow up in impact their educational outcomes. But I think that a much more complex study that's looking at many factors simultaneously, including, government impact, whether it be, from public schooling, from healthcare services provided, nutrition, the environment, after school programs, the environment that the children are growing up in, more generally, their family, all these things have an impact. And performing an analysis where we understand how those variables not only impact the children, but how those variables impact each other, is something that I want to get at some point in the future. One of the biggest hurdles to get over in order to do this type of analysis is getting my hands on the data appropriate to do the correct analysis. But yeah, that's one of the biggest challenge. That's a challenge that I've set for myself that I would like one day.
I guess diving into that, I imagine the length of that study or to collect data could take years to really see the outcomes of a policy. So how would you approach a problem statement like that is so broad and requires so many different factors, I guess, controlled variables? Because from past data work that I've done for airlines, financial managers, other platforms, we always work in a very controlled environment where there's a few toggles we can kind of trigger on and off. But with dealing with okay, what is the life impact on someone based on a certain policy? There's a million factors, whether it could be the weather that day, sunny or not, the traffic on the road, quality of sleep due to road noise. So how do you narrow that problem statement down?
So I don't want to narrow the problem statement down. I think all of these things impact each other, and it's a very complex network that impacts the outcomes of a child as they grow into adulthood. And I guess to add on, it's not a deterministic model. It's going to be a probabilistic model. You can't determine the outcome of a particular child based on the factors. You're just trying to generate a guiding probability based on all of the factors, and hopefully with a very strong confidence interval on whatever estimates you generate. But what was your question particularly in the beginning? I missed that one.
I was just curious about kind of narrowing the scope, because all the different factors that go into that. But that answers it on.
Yeah, and then my point with saying you're creating estimates, and you cannot predict deterministically the outcome of a particular individual, is just to say that the models are not going to be exact. And this is very much research, so this is more of a personal interest that's maybe a little less suitable for an institution that's primarily concerned with policy. But I think these are questions that need to be answered or investigated now so that we have the answers in the future. And to get back to your other point, the data available is not great. So I think the best approach would be to start collecting the data that would be necessary to achieve those goals in the future, while simultaneously seeing how much data we can gather in the present day, and using that data, as cleverly as we can to try to pry out the insights that we want to pry out from that data. So just be as clever as possible with the data that exists. And it might not be feasible, but if it is feasible, that would be great. At this point, I don't know that it is feasible, but it would need a much deeper dive to really make a determination on that.
Okay. Yeah. It sounds like there's a ton of opportunity with the data already out there in the world. Like, I've been on the New York City Open data page a few times. There's data sets for everything. So I imagine if you have the right problem, you can approach it there and solve. But kind of switching gears to a different question. So one challenge we always hear from our customers, basically, okay, we did this analysis, this project, and now need to go convince executive leadership or someone to make a decision in a company. So I imagine in city council, when you do a data project and they have to go convince voted in city council member to change the way they're thinking or bring in a new opinion, how do you approach that of trying to, I guess, educate people and convince them to follow your different analyses? And is that even a problem?
It is a problem, but in a different way. So
Okay.
we at central staff in the New York City Council do serve the needs of the city, and we work for the speaker, and we sometimes work with certain council members. But primarily, the investigations that we take on are driven by their requests for legislation. So we often may hear from an attorney that they have to draft legislation on a certain policy issue, and they want to see what the data says so that they can help make recommendations on how the legislation should be drafted. And they generally have these conversations with the council members, the elected officials who are requesting the drafting of this legislation. So we don't have the issue that we take on a certain project and then have to convince upper management to utilize the results of our investigations. More so that we have to put together a robust argument as to why it's important that they heed attention to what's coming out from the data analysis. And of course, we need to make sure that the analysis is robust so that it does convince them that the course of action being taken, whether it's Y or Z, should be influenced in a particular manner based on the outcomes of our data investigation.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I never really thought about it that way of, I guess they're starting with kind of a project or something that you're then in charge of going into and investigating a few steps farther versus, I don't know, I just imagine you have kind of free reign to all this data and then you can start drawing insights, recommending legislature. So I think I had the process kind of flipped on how it actually works.
We do perform independent investigations at times, but we don't really recommend legislation as much, though it is a possibility. We generally, because we are not elected officials, that's not our position. It's not our position to impact legislation. Our position is only to make recommendations to the elected officials who are the representatives of the residents of New York City. So we have to be impartial as much as we can be.
Okay, got it. I mean, that's good because I imagine if you were partial to one side or other on politics, be very high turnover, and then having a tenure like yours at the New York City Council wouldn't exist for anyone at all if you were partial to one side, for sure.
Yeah, that's.
What's your favorite project that you've had the chance to work on so far?
I guess my favorite project. I guess one of my favorite projects, for a variety of reasons, would have to be the investigation into pay equity. So I guess I'll give you a little backstory on how this came to be.
Yeah.
For many years, the city has been accused of paying certain groups less than they pay other groups. And so this is an issue that the council had been trying to address for a very, very long time. In 2017 and finally in 2018, under the direction of Lori Cumbo, former council member, along with Danique Miller, the council was able to pass local law, I believe 18 of 2019. It might have been passed the next year. Basically, it's known as the pay equity law colloquially. And this law mandated that the city provide to the council information on all, or not all, but most employees in city service. And that data set includes nearly 200,000 individuals and includes their age, date of when they started employment, their title, business title, level, their pay, their race, ethnicity, gender, managerial status, level of education, and such, agency. And so using that, we were, and by the way, getting the data was a process. It was a series of negotiations with the administration being very reluctant for logistical reasons to provide that data. It's a huge lift for them to gather that data. But eventually this happened. The legislation was passed, and the data team was able to perform the analysis. Now, before the detailed data was released, there was a aggregated data set that was released, and the aggregated data set showed very clearly that women in general were being paid less than men, and certain races and ethnicities were being paid less than others. Mainly speaking, white men were being paid more than everybody else. And so looking at the summary of the data and looking at the stark differences in the median and mean pay for different groups, I was expecting that when we performed a more rigorous statistical analysis, that we were going to see that there was bias in terms of the pay across these protected groups being race, ethnicity, gender. And I thought so because the difference in pay was so staggering. And I guess that wasn't necessarily the right way to think about it, because we then performed a mixed model regression on this data, accounting for the gender, race, ethnicity, title, agency, start date, age, years of experience, and a few other factors. And what came out of the analysis is that you can account for the difference in pay between these groups without it necessarily being gender or race or ethnicity, for the most part. There were still some differences due to gender, race, and ethnicity, but on the order of 1% salary differences. But according to the model, it was actually occupation that drove the bulk of the difference between the pay across these groups. And really, that was such a surprising conclusion, given what I had expected from the prior data set, that it intrigued me. And that's why I'm discussing this. And it's also something that's very, very relevant, very applicable. I think it's important to a lot of people in New York City. And so now, that doesn't say that we don't have anything to look into. Of course not. That just means that we need to understand why there's occupational segregation. Why is it that white men are in the jobs that are better paying than the jobs that other ethnicities, races, and women are taking?
Interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like at the, surface level, looking at kind of the aggregate data, there was a pretty sharp difference between different groups. And then once you dug in quite a bit farther and actually started running some analysis, grouping by different, I guess, features in this model, then it became obvious that the problem wasn't in fact just one group gets paid more than the other. It's that the groups have separate jobs. So does that give kind of a different approach then on how you have to solve that or an action? Because I imagine the steps on one is like, okay, people in the same job getting paid different, easy solution, just pay them the same. But if it's people have literally different jobs, and that gets into education, other things that happened before to lead up to that job. So how do you take that next step to address it? Or that might even fall on someone else.
Yeah. So we did try to address the next step. So it brought up many further questions. That was really the biggest thing. What it did was it eliminated, or it didn't completely eliminate, but it suggested that bias in the civil service system employed by the city wasn't really the root cause of the differences in salaries that we were seeing. Mm-hmm. It suggested that it was actually occupational segregation, as we saw. So now the question was, at what age? So, for example, we see that men and women earn similar salaries up until the age of 30 when things start to diverge. Oh. And so we started doing further investigations into things of that nature, or investigations into why in certain agencies and certain positions, the positions are just so predominantly staffed by white males. And so we started looking into these sorts of things, and some recommendations did come out. So, for example, we know that there's a greater number of single mothers than there are single fathers. And so one recommendation was to provide more public daycare services so that single parents could go to work. And with the idea that maybe that would alleviate some of the pay differences that we were seeing. And so that they would have a more flexible schedule as well. So if you don't have a flexible schedule, it may not permit you to take certain jobs, and that might limit your eligibility, in certain occupations, and that you could see how that could then go into driving occupational segregation. So,
and all of this data that you're working with is all public data that anyone can access then?
Not this.
Okay.
So we usually do work with public data sets, but this particular data set deals with data that could potentially identify personal information, PII, personally identifiable information. And so this data is made available to us annually through API, actually through a virtual machine in a very secure fashion where we can't copy and paste anything out of the systems. We run the analysis on the systems. We can't extract, we have to request that the analysis be extracted. So the concerns here with PII were huge. And so this is not, but there is a publicly available version, redacted version of the data set that stratifies salaries into, I think, $5,000 brackets different $5,000 and obfuscates some other data points so that the data is no longer considered PII. And that can be found on the Open Data Portal.
Oh, very cool. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about the Open Data Portal and what's available there?
Yeah, sure. So I guess as a little bit of background to the Open Data Portal, it was in 2012 that the New York City Council passed legislation mandating that the administration host an Open Data Portal and that all data made publicly available by the administration be hosted on that Open Data Portal so that it's all in the same format. It can all be downloaded in one uniform fashion, really simplifying the lives of civic, data scientists and civilian data scientists who want to help make an impact, who want to work on data relevant to the communities that they live in. And so you can find the data in the open data portal broken out by agency. So be it the NYPD, the Department of Health, the Department of Sanitation. You can find 311 data. A lot of these data sets will be up to date. You'll have year-to-date data sets and you'll have historical data sets in there. You can combine them to get a full picture of everything. They have a fantastic search bar that you can use. And within the browser, you can actually perform filtering. Some of these data sets are huge. So the in-browser filtering actually sends API queries to whichever database the administration is hosting and performs the filtering of the data on their end. And then you can download the filtered data. So, if you don't have access to large amounts of computational resources and you're looking at a particularly large data set like the 311 complaints data, it can be very helpful. It can also map the data for you. So I think the administration did a fantastic job when it comes to the open data portal.
Wow. And then do you have data challenges or other things out there right now where people in New York City can help you and your team kind of answer questions that exist? Is there like a queue that exists anywhere of, hey, we need people to solve?
To help us solve data challenges?
Yeah.
We don't, no. But
okay.
Very interesting idea to keep that in.
Yeah, I imagine all kinds of university students, aspiring data scientists around the world and New York City specifically would love to get their hands on and have the opportunity, if they win the challenge, to sit down and have you review their work or something.
That would be pretty cool. We do sometimes, if we're looking at a new topic, we'll view the literature or do some Google searches and see what other people have done to give us some inspiration. And sometimes some people make estimates of certain parameters at different geographic regions that are helpful, and we do incorporate that sometimes into some of our work. And of course, we cite them when we do.
Yeah. Nice. Would you be able to talk a little bit about your technology stack that you use? I know last time we spoke, it was a lot focused on different open source technologies, but curious to know what tools you're using on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, of course. So I have tried to make sure that the team uses only open source technology for everything that we do. Generally, because if it's open source, we can go into it and we can modify it however we need to. And so the team generally uses R, the data team. I guess I'm a deviant and I use Python, but it really doesn't. We are really technology agnostic. It doesn't matter what technology somebody wants to code in, as long as hopefully it's open source. Different technologies have their different strengths. So when I performed the pay equity analysis, I actually started coding in R because the statistical R is just a much stronger language when it comes to statistics. Python probably better for, if you want to do something like the web development unit at the council uses Django, Python Django. And so that's how we run the back end of our system. But really, I say, if you have an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of different technologies, then just use what you see fit. It helps to understand object-oriented programming. So a little bit more heavier computer science background could help a lot, but it's absolutely not necessary. Yeah. But really, we run some databases. We use Postgres, and I guess we'll dabble with HTML, JavaScript whenever we need. And if it gets really hairy and we need to do computations, like massive computations that, run super slow, we will do that in C++, and that's about it.
Interesting. It sounds like you cover basically every programming language there in a pretty regular fashion on your team then, between R, Python, HTML, C++. Very nice. And then just one last question here. So I'm curious about where you see the future of kind of data work within government entities going. Do you think it's at a good spot right now, or is there a lot of room to grow on what can be accomplished with data in kind of the public sector?
That's a great question. So, I mean, the data team at the council was 3 individuals before I joined, and I was able to grow it out quite a bit. And what I've seen since I've joined the council is that we've been successful in using data to drive evidence-based hearings and legislation. And this is something that I want to see become more commonplace as we move into the future. And I'm willing to bet that all city councils will have data scientists to assist them in breaking down data for the purpose of better serving the needs of their constituents in the future. Maybe not all, but like for larger cities, I think this is going to have to become something standard. Something that I'd like to see in the future is that we use data science, or just, science, analytics, statistics, to analyze incoming data and identify new problems arising in our societies. So it could be that we're analyzing data such as complaints, and so that we continue and increase the effort to use data to help us differentiate the most effective of the different forms of legislation that can then be implemented to address those issues.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I could see that working in real time, like taking all the kind of aggregate 311 calls and saying, okay, there's these issues in the parks that, I don't know, maybe there's no field availability space, or the street has too much construction noise on it. And if there's a kind of an automated pipeline flow that takes those in real time and aggregates them, distributes them, that could be super cool to drive, I guess, impactful change that people care about. Because I guess most people aren't really going to city council to voice their opinion, just probably a select few actually have time with jobs, work, families, everything to make it there.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of people. A lot of people will come over. There are commonly movements that you see out here in front of the council, in front of City Hall is what I'm trying to say. And so people are active, and the council members are often responding directly to these people who are active. But as many as it looks like there are, it's a very small fraction, as you're saying, of the 8-point-something million people who are residents of New York City.
Right. Awesome. Well, that covers my questions today. So thank you so much for hopping on and sharing more about your role and your background. So really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. And thank you for having me, Logan. It was a pleasure.